Welcome to 35 West. I'm Ryan Berg, Director of the Americas Program at CSIS and host of the 35 West podcast.
Was how professional the Mexican government.
Are we ready? I don't think.
Reform trends in Argentina.
Right. And that's what happened.
Role at all in the NAFTA negotiations.
Welcome to 35 West. I'm Henry Ziemer, Associate Fellow with the Americas Program at CSIS, and today, guest host of the 35 West podcast. Bound together by tight trade links, cultural ties, as well as mutual defense partnerships like NATO and NORAD, the U.S. Canada relationship has deep roots. Nevertheless, the relationship is not without its challenges, especially as Canada appears to continue to drag its feet on U.S. requests that it scale up defense spending to meet rising global security challenges. These lingering issues have been thrown into stark focus with the re-election of Donald Trump as U.S. president, raising concerns over the future trade and defense relationship. One area where the United States and Canada could nevertheless find fertile ground for closer cooperation is on securing mineral supply chains. Canada's vast reserves of critical minerals and technical expertise could make it an asset for U.S. efforts to both meet demand for commercial purposes and reduce its dependence on adversaries like China for certain defense critical minerals. To help us unpack the state of U.S.-Canada critical minerals cooperation and where we can expect it to go in the future, we are incredibly honored to be joined by Abigail Hunter, Executive Director of the Center for Critical Minerals Strategy at Securing America's Future Energy, or SAFE. In this episode, we'll delve into the types of minerals most important to U.S.-Canada cooperation, as well as what role governments in Washington and Ottawa should play in fostering greater investment in critical minerals security. Thank you so much for joining us today, Abigail.
Thanks, Henry. It's really an honor to be with you this morning.
Abigail, you've had an up-close view of mining policy in both the United States and Canada. Could you begin by sketching a scene setter for our audience? What's the current state of U.S.-Canada cooperation on critical minerals, and what are the main strengths and weaknesses of this partnership?
So I always trace Canada-U.S. cooperation on minerals back to World War II. I wrote my master's thesis on aluminum's connection to energy and national defense. The United States invested sizably in the aluminum sector in Canada to fuel the Allied war effort in World War II. They provided technical assistance, loans, support of industry investment. The United States enabled Canada to increase production tenfold in the war period, making Canada, if not the number one producer at that time. And that wasn't exclusive to aluminum. Canada became an essential supplier of nickel, copper, zinc. All of these fueled the Allied war effort, especially munitions, aircrafts, ships, and vehicles. You flash forward several decades later, you now have the U.S. Canada Joint Action Plan on Critical Minerals that started in the Trump administration and has continued under the Biden administration. And then you have the Biden administration's Energy Transformation Task Force, alongside with several connected incentives for North American mineral supply chains that emerged out of the Inflation Reduction Act, Defense Production Act Title III provisions that include Canada as a domestic source. So there's a clear history of cooperation, and then there's some new modern day approaches to it. I think our biggest weakness here compared to our successes in increasing production in war times is our lack of a shared vision of what we need to do to counter our common geopolitical competitor today. We have awareness of where the resources are, what we need to do with them, but without that shared vision and the steps needed towards reaching it, we don't necessarily have the ability to bring mineral supplies online as quickly or effectively as possible. And one thing here I should just note is I think that recognition is really important, that the United States, while having abundant mineral resources, energy resources that are needed to contribute to diversifying these supply chains and therefore securing them, we do need to rely on our allied partners for their mineral capacities as well as their histories as mining jurisdictions, their expertise in mining and processing. And here Canada has a big role to play. As a result of that, SAFE actually changed our name from Securing America's Future Energy, as you alluded to in your opening, to just SAFE, because we wanted to reflect back to Washington that we do need that cooperation with our allies.
Thank you for that. As a fellow history buff, I always appreciate the history beginning in World War II. As we flash forward to today, much of modern great power competition has brought with it, as you mentioned, more scrutiny in the United States of where our suppliers of critical resources come from. And one especially troubling sort of portent of where we could go in the future with critical minerals competition has been China's announcement of export controls on a variety of different minerals, including gallium, germanium, graphite, and most recently antimony. In your opinion, where is Canada best positioned to compete with China or come in as an alternative supplier of critical minerals?
I think this is a really, really important question today because we're expecting further export control announcements on December 1st that have been kind of laid out over the past few weeks, with a particular pointedness towards the upstream, as China tends to do, given their dominance in the mineral processing and then grip on extraction, not only at home, but in other countries where those resources are abundant. I think Canada's biggest role to play is particularly in helping us on the midstream. I mean, Canada also has an incredible mineral resources in the upstream, but the co-location of refining, smelting, even separation, and then metallization, if you're looking at rare earth supply chains, becomes really important, where you can build up that supply alongside Canada's incredible energy abundance and industrial rates that they provide for that energy, coupled with the incredible land that Canada has to be able to build out those supply chains. I was just visiting Mountain Pass MP Materials rare earth site, and we were talking a lot about the metallization plans in the United States, and they were just talking about the sheer abundance of energy you need to actually put in to have cost-effective metallization processes. And my ears kind of rung again on, the aluminum competitive angle that Canada holds with just the hydropower that fuels aluminum smelters in Canada. We need to leverage what Canada does best, which is the ability to have that refining and smelting capacity. And there again, we have that kind of challenge I pointed to at the beginning. Canada and the United States want to have these soups to nuts supply chains for the energy transition, electrification, digitization, but we need to lean on each other's respective strengths to actually put a dent in that competition. China dominates processing above all else. Geology is stubborn, but ultimately we do have more diversification of where these minerals are located, but we do not have diversification on where they are processed.
That's fascinating. I want to really drill down now into maybe one specific mineral, which is something that CSIS has done quite a bit of work on, and that's niobium. So niobium is unique in that Brazil produces the vast majority of it, but China has stepped up its investments in Brazilian niobium operations in recent years, raising a lot of concerns about the future of those supply chains. Canada, meanwhile, has this world's second largest niobium reserves behind Brazil, but it just produces a fraction of global output. So with what we've talked about just now about Canada's mining sector and processing sector, generally, what more, in your opinion, is needed to bolster Canada's competitiveness in the niobium sector specifically?
So I'm going to sound like a broken record because really we just keep pushing again and again on the need for diversification. The story you just described with niobium is very similar with nickel, where Australia has the same amount of nickel reserves as Indonesia, but Indonesia is the world's biggest producer, bolstered by investments from China, Chinese operators on the archipelago. And so you have this market concentration that makes it really, really hard to compete. Ultimately, in well-functioning markets, prices are determined by supply and demand. And so investments increase when prices are high, investments slow down when prices are low. And then the cycle is influenced by lead times and market balance. So if you're thinking about the cost of production versus price for niobium, it makes it really hard for niobium producers to compete today when we have a lot of investment in production supplying the market. So we need to be able to determine whether or not we need to have some type of government intervention to support bringing on new supply when there is ample supply, despite the low price environment. So these are things that are making it challenging for Canadian producers to make that investment. We heard this firsthand from a roundtable you guys hosted a few weeks ago on this subject.
Getting a little bit more in on this question of what governments can do to support greater production. The fact that China simply has a lot of funding to throw around on the refining side, as you mentioned, so dominates the midstream of minerals, is often cited as a deterrent for companies that are looking to bring more mineral production online in, say, the United States or Canada. This is especially true when it comes to minerals that are sort of produced in smaller quantities, like REEs or these more bespoke mineral inputs. What's the appetite for governments to either provide debt support or other financing incentives to mitigate China's competitive, or I might say anti-competitive advantage in this space?
The overcapacity challenge has been one that's been plaguing these markets for a long time. There was a lot of work on overcapacity for steel and aluminum in the Obama administration. And so it's really important for us to kind of look backwards to look forwards. When it comes to kind of countering overcapacity, we do need to kind of stand together really effectively with our allies, because we're only as strong as we are in terms of letting material kind of leak in, lower cost, often lower standard material leak in, that then creates a competitive disadvantage for material producers that are exporting to third countries or importing those materials at a lower cost than, maybe the producers that we'd like to see come online. So we need to kind of stand together in what are really, really complicated and highly global supply chains where mineral commodities change hands around a dozen times before they actually become that final input piece. I've seen great headway in this with a mineral security partnership, which we're partnered with the State Department on through a project called Minvest, a minerals investment network. The MSP represents about half the world's GDP. They're trying to work on strategic projects together to draw in that investment that you're alluding to, particularly through export credit agency development finance, where you can see kind of the increased lending potential, in some cases equity. They also have a few government-backed funds now that are increasingly coming online that they're utilizing to this end. And at the most recent Minvest MSP Finance convening in September, they announced, okay, we're actually going to work together from a financing institution angle through the financing network that Minvest will continue to support. So you're seeing a little bit more information sharing and then ideally more co-financing when the opportunity presents itself. You talked about the lower market cap minerals, maybe the co-financing isn't as needed there, but some of these bigger market cap minerals, the price tag merits actual coupled investment and working together. And that's not new. These export credit agencies, development finance institutions do this in certain instances, diligence together alongside, other commercial lenders.
So while there's widespread acknowledgement and growing interest in solving the question of critical minerals supply chain security, I think what our conversation has just highlighted is that it's not so simple as just identifying new sources or where the minerals in the ground are. It requires close coordination, not just at the mine site, but across the whole processing and supply chain. So greater mining in the United States and Canada, of course, means little if these countries lack the infrastructure to process the raw materials into usable states. What are the barriers to bringing more advanced processing online in both countries, let's say?
So we already talked about one, energy. I think that we obviously have a great amount of abundant energy in the processing midstream hubs that you're seeing emerge in North America. I used to work for the Quebec government, so Bécancour is one battery campus to highlight. But then also you have the Southeast Battery Belt as well, right, where you're seeing a lot of energy potential draw in investment in the midstream. However, is that sufficient for the longer term? Can we get to the phase 2 of those investments in those projects without further investment in energy infrastructure? I don't think so. That's why you're seeing such a big push in the lame duck to still try to get the Energy Permitting Reform Act through, because we need more generation, more transmission to actually have the energy fuel sources to fuel the energies of the future. I work a lot with some of the premier's offices, and they talk about wanting to export their energy potential to the United States. You already have histories of this happening with Manitoba, Minnesota, North Dakota through transmission interconnections, and then Quebec with New England and New York. Ontario wants to do this more on nuclear and then be able to, support the United States industrial ambitions that way. My question to them was, well, how are you going to get those cross-border transmission lines built? We do need to have that level of intervention with the Energy Permitting Reform Act to actually see more transmission, more energy sources generally agnostic of what they are built to meet those demands. And so there's a cross-border angle to that to come into play. Beyond the energy, as you alluded to, we do need the built infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, port infrastructure built at home, overseas, to be able to support increased movement of these heavy goods. So lack of infrastructure has been pointed to in different studies on Canada's mineral potential as an inhibiting factor and something we need to work on. Additionally, high capital costs. Processing projects are, I think, between like 300 to 500 million, need to be able to have those investments made through, existing government funding sources, but then ideally catalyzing the private sector finance. And with the low price environment, it's somewhat hard to do that today.
So even if we could sort of get this wish list that you've laid out, there's going to be a final hurdle in successfully connecting new suppliers of critical minerals in the United States and Canada to the end users in, the commercial and defense sectors, who are often pretty concerned about their suppliers and have a high barrier to vetting a new supplier. How can governments in both countries encourage private companies also to realign their supply chains and connect them with the critical mineral producers?
Today we're competing on cost, right? The lowest cost supplier is always going to win when your downstream industries are also facing an incredible competition with China. If we're thinking about the automotive supply chain with new EVs that are much lower cost at scale than what our incumbent OEMs are trying to stand up. So that presents a challenge, right? These companies have to report quarterly to be able to successfully compete, and stay afloat in what is a huge shift of their supply chains already from ICE to EVs, internal combustion engine vehicles to electric vehicles. I think we put a lot of onus on the downstream industries to do this, and they do have to play an important role in this. They do need to kind of stand up and try to have these higher standard, more secure supplier bases, not just for the automotive sector, but consumer electronics to a certain degree. Obviously, our defense supply chains together, there's not an incredible amount of demand for those second two groups compared to the automotive sector. So we do kind of look to them a little bit more for the diversification needed. So it's not just about kind of getting new supply, as you said in your question before, but really making sure that supply is competitive. One big thing there is we have to make sure that we are increasing transparency of those supply chains. Right now, you can't really distinguish between, a supplier from a non-secure source and a secure one when you have such opacity across the supply chain. So we need transparency to help support that. And then we need kind of agreed upon standards with our allies, potentially starting with Canada, where we already have such shared values and similar domestic regulations on where we're going to be importing these materials and any kind of barriers, like I said before, on preventing lower standard, less secure sources into the countries.
And now for our last segment of the podcast, I think I'd be remiss to not mention the implications of the U.S. presidential election for the bilateral relationship. It's been on everyone's minds. I'm certain that you have been taking questions left, right, and center about what this means for the future of U.S. Canada critical minerals cooperation, and specifically in anticipation of a Trump government that is angling to put more pressure on Canada to up its defense spending. Canada seems to be making the case that its mineral investments can backstop shortfalls in more traditional defense security related areas. How might improving critical minerals cooperation with the United States kind of allay some of these critiques? And what could we be looking at for Canada's elections, which I know will have to happen by October 2025?
Yeah, really, really great, timely questions. I've been talking to a lot of people close to the incoming government and just monitoring for the last 3 administrations' action here. I don't think critical minerals as a topic is going anywhere. I feel like I have job security in terms of its importance. And certainly, while we've seen an incredible flurry of actions on critical mineral related issues in the last 2 administrations, we have by no means solved our vulnerabilities here. I think regardless will continue. And then it makes an incredible amount of sense to work with our closest partner, who also is really integrated in our economy and therefore key to our economic competitiveness globally, to be able to kind of meet some of these challenges. So I think Canada remains very relevant. We did see in the Trump administration use of the 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum. That obviously had effects on Canada and Mexico's industries for those sectors. And so it will be interesting to kind of monitor how that action may change or not in an incoming Trump administration. Like I said at the start, you have the U.S. Canada Joint Action Plan on Critical Minerals that began in the Trump administration that the Biden administration kept on. I hope that gets elevated further in the incoming government, where we can actually see maybe more action than we had previously seen using that body. In terms of your question about Canada's ability to maybe use their mineral investments as a means to kind of meet defense required investments. It's a really interesting query, because obviously you could argue that infrastructure investments in some countries closer to conflict areas could also count towards defense spending in some ways, as you increase interoperability and the ability to kind of move goods, military equipment, people on the front lines, et cetera. So I think Canada will have to be able to make that argument in the face of that. How is this not kind of a dangerous precedent setting with regards to meeting defense spending requirements? That said, obviously, these mineral input have profound uses to enhance our military equipment, especially military equipment that's becoming increasingly digitized and electric, for the benefits that they provide on the ground. So Canada may have to think through kind of contributing to joint stockpiling efforts, which we've heard a lot of news about recently, not only in Washington, but joint purchasing in Brussels. The IEA has talked about kind of developing this for more energy applications. So Canada could maybe contribute to some of these defense needs through more effective joint stockpiling efforts, and that are a little bit more considerate of a single source of supply that might precipitate challenges for increased defense production, especially amidst rising export controls that you brought up earlier. So I could see an argument made there. But then when I was working for the Quebec government, we were very cognizant of how Canadian citizens felt about what's taken in their subsoil going towards U.S. defense efforts. It obviously is our collective defense efforts as we fight for democracy, but you have to answer to that too north of the border. With the elections coming in Canada and what Poilievre has been kind of pushing for in terms of more fiscal austerity, how are you going to use investments in critical minerals to kind of offset that when you want to potentially see less government spending? That's something I would point to there.
Thank you so much for that. Now, is there anything else that you would like to highlight or add?
One thing I would just add in terms of maybe where we could do a better job coordinating and engaging, we need to have more thoughtfulness about where U.S. incentives and policies stop and then where Canada incentives policies pick up. So kind of where are we passing the baton? We inevitably will have a really integrated supply chain for these new end products, modern technologies of the 21st century. How are we making sure that we're being competitive collectively rather than just having so much competition? I stole this term from ADM Labonte, from NRCan, that we need more coopetition because we ultimately have the same geopolitical competitor. We're struggling to kind of stand up these new industries here, strengthen existing industries here to meet new demand. But right now we're focused on kind of competing with each other. And so how do we make sure there's that complementarity across policies? A good example is you have one of the biggest zinc mines in the world, Red Dog Tech, as in Alaska, but they do the purification of that zinc to the 45X production tax credit levels in the Inflation Reduction Act in British Columbia. Then that zinc mostly gets sold south of the border back into the United States. They do not qualify for that juicy 45X 10% production tax credit because they're doing it north of the border. There's certainly similar elements of this in the inverse as well. So we need to be able to kind of calibrate those instruments so that we're ultimately being collectively competitive. It's tough when you have unilateral action, usually more ready at the fingertips than some of these kind of joint actions, but something we could really endeavor to work on in a new administration.
Abigail Hunter, Executive Director of the Center for Critical Mineral Strategy at SAFE. Thank you so much for joining us on 35 West. We appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today.
For you, thank you for joining. Stay tuned for the next episode of 35 West.